She pulled a bubbling casserole from the oven in 1953, feeding 6 people on less than $1, and the secret sat on the pantry shelf the whole time. These were not sad, defeated meals. Post-war homemakers in the late 1940s and 1950s turned a can of soup, a bag of noodles, and a small amount of meat into a full supper for a family of 6, and they did it on purpose, with real skill. 10 of these dishes are coming, from a Depression-era steak made without steak to a Texas casserole nobody can agree was actually invented in Texas. The 6th one on this list started as an ordinary Tuesday side dish and ended up in a museum, and almost nobody making it tonight knows why. One thing before we go on, and I will not mention it again. Everything I have gathered about keeping a house the old way is written down plain in Clara's 2 little books. The first link below this video will take you to it. If you would like it, it is there. That is all. Walk into a homemaker's pantry in the middle of the 1950s, and you would find the same red and white can standing guard on nearly every shelf. Campbell's had introduced condensed cream of mushroom soup back in 1934, and by the post-war years, it had become something close to a secret weapon. One can replace a homemade white sauce that would have taken butter, flour, warm milk, and a watchful hand at the stove. Pour it over almost anything, bake it, and dinner was done. The first dish built on that shortcut started, of all places, with a can of tuna. Picture a Friday evening in a small kitchen, the smell of hot noodles and canned soup thick in the air, and a mother pulling a glass dish out of the oven with a dish towel because she never did buy the good mitts. Tuna noodle casserole was the dish that closed out the week in millions of American homes. Egg noodles, a can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and whatever crunchy topping was left in the cupboard. It was fast, it was cheap, and it fed everyone at the table without a second trip to the butcher. Canned tuna became a pantry staple after World War II, as California canneries around San Pedro and Monterey scaled up to feed a growing country. At the same time, roughly a quarter of American households were Catholic and still kept the old custom of no meat on Friday. Canned fish solved that weekly problem in one dish, egg noodles and a can of soup doing the rest of the work. But the topping that made the whole thing worth eating twice a month did not come from the tuna aisle at all. A single casserole dish built from egg noodles, 1 can of tuna, 1 can of soup, and a handful of crushed crackers or potato chips on top could feed a family of 5 or 6 for well under $1 in the money of the day. A modest cut of meat alone could cost several times that for the same number of plates. A homemaker did not need a ledger to know the arithmetic. She needed a grocery budget stretched across 7 dinners and a dish filling enough that nobody left the table still hungry. That arithmetic worked every single week, and one particular topping trick made the dish taste like it cost more than it did. The crushed topping on a tuna noodle casserole was rarely bought special for the occasion. A nearly empty bag of potato chips sitting in the cupboard, crumbs and all, got emptied over the top before the dish went into the oven because chips fried in fat already tasted rich and gave the same crunch as breadcrumbs for nothing extra. Crushed saltine crackers worked the same way when there were no chips to spare. That same habit of stretching every last crumb is the reason one woman's tuna casserole ended up feeding a neighbor's family too, not just her own. In small towns across the Midwest, a tuna casserole was not just a family supper, it was currency. When a neighbor took sick, had a new baby, or lost a husband, other women in the church or the block did not send flowers first. They sent a casserole, still warm, wrapped in a dish towel, carried across the yard in both hands. Tuna noodle casserole was a favorite for this exact reason, cheap enough to make twice in 1 week without complaint, and hearty enough that an exhausted family did not have to cook for a night or two. That tradition of the Sympathy Casserole outlived almost every other use of the dish, and it is still recognizable today at church suppers, even if fewer people know why it started with tuna. It is easy to assume tuna noodle casserole disappeared because tastes changed, but the bigger reason was time, not flavor. Once more, women entered paid work through the 1960s and 1970s, a dish that needed noodles boiled, a sauce assembled, and an oven preheated lost out to something that could go from box to table in 15 minutes. The casserole itself was never the problem. It was built for a kitchen where one person had the whole afternoon, and fewer kitchens looked like that as the decades went on. What replaced it on Friday nights borrowed more from this dish than most people realize. Tuna noodle casserole leaned on a can of fish for its protein. The next dish on this list did something almost the opposite. It took the cheapest form of meat in the store, ground beef, and through nothing but crushed crackers, a cold refrigerator, and a firm hand, turned it into something a family could serve and call, without irony, a steak. A woman in a farmhouse kitchen during the hardest years of the Depression pressed a pound of ground beef mixed with crushed saltine crackers into a loaf pan, slid it into the icebox, and let it sit overnight until it was firm enough to slice into steak-shaped portions. There was no steak in the house. There might not be steak in the house again for weeks, but by morning she had something that looked like one, breaded and ready for the skillet. Poor man's steak earned its name. Honestly, it was never meant to fool anyone into thinking it was a real cut of beef. It was meant to give a family the shape and ceremony of a steak dinner on a ground beef budget. Poor man's steak traces back to the Great Depression itself, when stretching a small amount of ground beef across a full family dinner was not a lifestyle choice, it was survival. The core method, crushed crackers mixed into the meat and a long chill to help it hold its shape, stayed essentially unchanged for 2 decades. Then, in 1952, Lipton introduced a dry onion soup mix, and homemakers across the country started stirring a packet of it straight into the meat mixture or into the gravy poured over the top. A dish born in hardship got a small, cheerful post-war upgrade without ever losing its original purpose. The math behind poor man's steak was blunt and deliberate. A single pound of ground beef, the cheapest cut sold at the counter, could be stretched with cracker crumbs and a beaten egg to serve 4 or 5 people instead of 2 or 3, and it cost a small fraction of what an actual steak for the same table would have run. Families who could not remember the last time they had eaten a true cut of beef could still sit down to something shaped like one, seared at the edges, smothered in gravy, served with pride rather than apology. That pride is the part modern retellings of Depression cooking usually leave out. The technique mattered as much as the ingredients. Ground beef was seasoned and mixed with crushed crackers and often a beaten egg to bind it, then pressed firmly into a loaf pan or shaped by hand into thick ovals. The critical step came next, a chill in the icebox for several hours or overnight, which let the crumbs absorb moisture and the shape hold together under heat. Only after that rest was each portion sliced, breaded again, and pan-fried until the outside browned, like a real seared steak, while the inside stayed tender. Skip the chilling step, and the whole illusion fell apart in the skillet. One church cookbook from rural Ohio, passed down through 3 generations, still lists poor man's steak under the heading Sunday dinner, not Depression cooking, a small detail that says everything about how the dish was actually used. Families who had lived through the worst of the 1930s kept making it well into the 1950s, not because they still had to, but because it had become a genuine family favorite, tied to Sunday afternoons and grandmothers who insisted the crackers had to be crushed by hand, never in a blender. Recipes like this rarely survive by accident. Someone has to keep insisting the old way is still the right way. It is tempting to assume a dish called poor man's steak vanished the moment real steak became affordable again, but that misreads why families kept it around. By the 1950s, many of these households could afford meat more often, yet the dish stayed in rotation because it had become genuinely good on its own terms, not just a stand-in for something better. What finally pushed it out of weekly kitchens decades later was not embarrassment. It was the sheer number of steps, the mixing, the chilling, the double breading, at a time when a full-time working household increasingly wanted dinner solved in 20 minutes flat. Poor man's steak turned meat into something formal. The next dish did the opposite, and it came from a single Ohio restaurant kitchen, not a Depression-era farmhouse at all. It mixed ground beef with tomato sauce, cheese, and noodles into one bubbling pan, and it became so beloved in one region that public school cafeterias were still serving it generations later, named after a man most of the children eating it had never met. In 1896, an Italian immigrant named Teresa Marzetti opened a small restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place with checked tablecloths and a menu built on food that filled a working person up without emptying their wallet. Somewhere in her kitchen, a dish came together that would outlive the restaurant itself: ground beef browned with onions, folded into a rich tomato sauce, layered with wide egg noodles and a blanket of melted cheese, then baked until the edges turned crisp. It was named for her brother-in-law, Johnny Marzetti, and it would go on to feed generations of families who never once set foot in Columbus. What began as a restaurant special did not stay behind a counter for long. Home cooks across Ohio and the surrounding Midwest picked up the recipe through neighbors, church cookbooks, and newspaper food columns, and by the 1950s it had settled into home kitchens as a Tuesday night staple, cheap enough for a large family and simple enough for a home cook without restaurant training. Perhaps more remarkably, it crossed over into public school cafeterias, where cooks could make a single enormous pan stretch across an entire lunchroom. Some Ohio schools were still serving a version of it decades after Teresa Marzetti's restaurant itself had closed. Johnny Marzetti worked on the same principle as most of the dishes on this list: a small amount of ground beef stretched by a large amount of noodles and sauce. A single pound of meat, browned and mixed into tomato sauce with onions and green pepper, could fill a 9x13 pan large enough to feed 8 people comfortably, with leftovers for the next day's lunch. For a household feeding 4 or 5 children on one income, a dish that reheated well and grew more flavorful on the second day was worth more than its ingredient list alone suggested. The trick home cooks learned quickly was that Johnny Marzetti tasted better the second day, after the sauce had a night in the icebox to soak into the noodles. So many families deliberately made it a day ahead for Sunday dinner, or made a double batch on purpose. A layer of shredded cheddar on top, rather than mixed all the way through, gave the dish a crisp, browned crust that made it feel closer to a special occasion than a Tuesday leftover. Small choices like that, order of layering, a rest in the icebox, separated a forgettable pan of noodles from a dish people asked for by name. Ask someone who grew up in central Ohio in the 1950s what Johnny Marzetti tasted like, and many of them will not describe a home kitchen first. They will describe a cafeteria tray, a formica table, and a lunch lady who had made the same dish thousands of times. For an entire generation, this was not just a family recipe passed down quietly. It was a shared public memory, something an entire school full of children ate on the same day, which is a very different kind of survival than most of the dishes on this list managed. It is a common assumption that a dish this regional simply stayed regional and quietly disappeared everywhere else, but that is not quite accurate. Versions of the same idea, ground beef, tomato sauce, noodles, and cheese, spread nationally under other names: casserole, hamburger, noodle bake, goulash, without most people realizing they were eating a distant cousin of an Ohio restaurant recipe. What actually faded was the specific name and the specific story behind it, not the dish itself, which is still hiding in plain sight on dinner tables that have never heard of Teresa Marzetti. Johnny Marzetti came from a restaurant kitchen with a name attached to it. The next dish on this list came from somewhere far less comfortable, an army mess hall, and the men who ate it there gave it a nickname their mothers would never have said out loud at the dinner table: A young soldier stood in a mess hall line during the Second World War, tray in hand, waiting for a cook to ladle a thick, creamy mixture studded with paper-thin dried beef over 2 slices of toast. It was filling, it was fast to make for hundreds of men at once, and it was, by nearly universal agreement among the men who ate it, not very good, which is exactly why they gave it a nickname involving the words save and stomachs that was a good deal more colorful in the original. When those same men came home, plenty of their wives learned to make it anyway. Dried, salt-cured beef sliced paper thin and packed into small glass jars had been standard U.S. Army ration fare going back to the First World War, prized because it needed no refrigeration and lasted for months in a supply depot or a soldier's pack. Creamed over toast, it became such a fixture of both world wars that the nickname SOS followed American servicemen across 2 entire generations of conflict. What started as ration-issue survival food became, almost by accident, a genuine piece of shared military culture, one that outlasted both wars and walked straight into civilian kitchens with the veterans who had eaten it. A single small jar of dried chipped beef, mixed into a simple white sauce of butter, flour, and milk, could stretch across 4 or 5 servings of toast for pennies compared to any fresh cut of meat. It needed no icebox space before it was opened, which mattered in an era when refrigerators were smaller and less reliable than today's, and it kept on a pantry shelf for months, ready whenever the grocery budget ran thin toward the end of the week. For a young post-war family setting up their first kitchen with very little money, that kind of shelf-stable protein was not a novelty, it was a genuine safety net. The dish lived or died on the white sauce. Butter melted in a skillet, flour whisked in to form a roux, then milk added slowly to avoid lumps, thickened until it coated the back of a spoon before the shredded dried beef went in at the very end so it would not turn tough and stringy from overcooking. Some homemakers soaked the dried beef in warm water first to soften its edge and cut back on the saltiness, a small adjustment passed down more by watching a mother's hands than by any written instruction. Get the sauce wrong, too thin or too thick, and the whole dish fell apart on the toast underneath it. Veterans who came home in the late 1940s did not always talk easily about what they had seen overseas, but plenty of them would happily tell a story about the mess hall and the meal everyone complained about and secretly looked forward to anyway. Wives learned to make chipped beef on toast partly from cookbooks and partly from listening to their husbands describe, in surprising detail, exactly how the Army version tasted so they could try to improve on it at home. In a strange, quiet way, this dish became one of the few pieces of a soldier's service that made it safely onto the family dinner table. It is easy today to treat a dish nicknamed after a phrase about stomachs as a joke and nothing more, but for the families who ate it through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, it was simply Tuesday supper, unremarkable and reliable. Did your mother or grandmother have a dish like this one, something a little humble that showed up on the table more often than anyone admitted out loud? I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. What eventually pushed chipped beef off the weekly menu was not embarrassment about its wartime nickname, it was the slow disappearance of the small glass jar itself from grocery store shelves as shopping habits changed. Chipped beef survived rationing because it was never rationed the same way fresh meat was. The next dish on this list survived the exact same wartime shortage for the exact same reason, a canned meat product that stayed on grocery shelves when almost nothing else did, and it became so central to one part of the country that it never really left, even after the shortage ended. In 1937, the Hormel Company in Austin, Minnesota, began selling a canned, spiced ham product with a name that would become instantly recognizable: Spam. Nobody in that factory could have predicted that within a decade, it would be baked into casseroles in kitchens from Ohio to the Hawaiian Islands, sliced and browned in a skillet, layered with sliced potatoes, canned vegetables, and a can of soup, then baked until the top turned golden, and slightly crisp at the edges. It looked unglamorous sitting on the counter, and it fed a family for almost nothing. During the Second World War, the Federal Office of Price Administration rationed fresh beef and pork by coupon, but canned meat products like Spam were not restricted the same way, which meant a homemaker could put dinner on the table without spending a single precious meat coupon. Millions of families leaned on it precisely because it sat outside the rules that governed everything else in the meat case. By the time the war ended, an entire generation had learned to treat a can of Spam not as a substitute for real meat, but as a genuine, dependable ingredient in its own right. A single 12-ounce can of Spam, sliced and stretched across a full casserole with potatoes, onions, and a can of soup, could feed a family of 5 or 6 for a fraction of the cost of an equivalent amount of fresh ham or beef. It required no butcher, no refrigeration before opening, and no waste, since every slice from the can was usable. For families managing a tight weekly grocery budget in the post-war years, that combination of low cost and zero spoilage risk made it one of the most reliable proteins a homemaker could keep on the shelf for weeks at a time, waiting for the night it was needed. The key to a good Spam casserole was managing its saltiness rather than fighting it. Homemakers learned to pair thin slices with plain, starchy partners like potatoes or rice that could soak up flavor without competing against it, and many browned the slices in a dry skillet first to render some fat and firm up the edges before layering it into the baking dish. A can of cream of mushroom or cream of celery soup, thinned with a splash of milk, tied the layers together into something closer to a scalloped potato dish than a plain fried meat plate. Small technique choices like these turned a much-mocked pantry can into something people genuinely requested. Nowhere did Spam take root more permanently than in Hawaii, then a U.S. territory where wartime shipping disruptions made fresh meat deliveries unreliable, and canned meat became a genuine dietary staple rather than a stopgap. Long after the shortage ended and shipping routes returned to normal, Spam remained deeply woven into local cooking there in a way it never quite did on the mainland, appearing in dishes that had nothing to do with rationing anymore and everything to do with taste and habit. It is one of the clearest examples on this entire list of a wartime poor man's ingredient that outlived the emergency that created it. It is a common misconception that Spam disappeared from mainland kitchens because people were ashamed of it once real meat became affordable again. In truth, it simply stopped being a weekly necessity and became an occasional choice, still bought, still used, just no longer required the way it once was. And remember, one recipe on this list started as an ordinary Tuesday side dish and ended up sitting in a museum case. We are getting close to that one now. What replaced Spam casserole on most mainland tables in the 1960s was not a rejection of canned meat. It was simply more choice at the grocery store than any prior generation had ever had. Spam casserole leaned on wartime scarcity to earn its place at the table. The next dish had the opposite origin story entirely. It was not born out of hardship or a ration book. It was invented on purpose, in a corporate test kitchen, by a woman whose name almost nobody knew until decades later, and it would go on to become one of the most repeated recipes in American history. In 1955, inside the Campbell Soup Company's home economics test kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, a staff dietitian named Dorcas Riley sat with a small team, tasked with inventing a fast vegetable side dish for a wire service recipe feature. She reached for what was already sitting on the test kitchen shelves: canned green beans, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and canned fried onions, and combined them into a simple bake meant to be published once and likely forgotten. It had no connection at all yet to the holiday it would one day take over. The dish, first published as a green bean bake through the Associated Press, spread through newspaper food pages and Campbell's own soup can labels far faster than anyone in that test kitchen expected. Within a few years, it had quietly attached itself to Thanksgiving tables across the country, not through any deliberate marketing campaign aimed at the holiday, but simply because it was easy enough for even a nervous first-time hostess to make well, and forgiving enough to sit warm on a crowded table for an hour without falling apart. Campbell's later estimated it as one of the single most prepared recipes ever printed on an American product. Part of what made the green bean casserole spread so fast was how little it demanded from a home cook's budget or her time. A can of green beans, a can of soup, and a small container of fried onions cost only a little more than the vegetables alone would have, and the entire dish came together in the time it took to preheat an oven. For a homemaker juggling an entire holiday menu, a dish that required no chopping, no separate sauce, and almost no attention while it baked was not a luxury. It was a genuine relief on the busiest cooking day of the year. The dish's brilliance was structural, not culinary. Cream of mushroom soup did double duty as both sauce and seasoning, coating the beans without a separate roux, while the canned fried onions delivered crunch and browned flavor without a single extra pot to wash. Dorcas Riley and her team deliberately built the recipe around ingredients that were shelf-stable and already familiar to nearly every household in the country, which meant no homemaker had to buy a single unusual item to make it. That deliberate simplicity, more than any flavor breakthrough, is the real reason it never really left the shelf. Dorcas Riley kept working at Campbell's for decades after 1955, largely unrecognized outside the company for the dish that had quietly become part of millions of family holidays. That changed in 2002, when her original handwritten recipe card was formally added to the collection of the National Inventors Hall of Fame in Akron, Ohio. A rare moment when an everyday household recipe and the specific woman who wrote it received the same kind of institutional recognition usually reserved for engineers and scientists. It remains one of the only casseroles on this entire list with a single, documented, named Inventor. The biggest misconception about this dish is that it was always a holiday special. For its first several years, it was marketed and eaten as a regular weeknight side dish, appearing on dinner tables in the middle of an ordinary week just as often as at Thanksgiving. Unlike most of the other dishes on this list, it never really faded from American kitchens at all. It simply narrowed, over time, from an everyday habit into an annual ritual, which may be the real reason it survives today when so many of its post-war cousins do not. The green bean casserole has a clear birth certificate, a named inventor, a date, and a test kitchen address. The next dish on this list has almost none of that. It carries the name of one of the largest cattle ranches in Texas history, and yet food historians still cannot agree on who actually invented it, or exactly when, which makes it one of the strangest mysteries on this entire list. A church supper in a small South Texas town in the 1950s would often have at least one enormous foil-covered pan sitting at the center of the table. Layers of shredded chicken, corn tortillas cut into strips, a rich blend of cream soups and chilies, and a thick cap of melted cheese baked until it bubbled at the edges. Everyone at the table called it King Ranch chicken, after the sprawling South Texas cattle operation founded back in 1853, even though almost nobody serving it that night could actually explain why the name belonged to a chicken dish at all. Unlike the green bean casserole, King Ranch chicken has no known inventor, no dated test kitchen, and no original recipe card sitting in a museum anywhere. Food historians generally agree it entered wide circulation through Texas church and community cookbooks sometime around the 1950s and 1960s, but the exact date and the person who first combined chicken, tortillas, and canned soup this way remain genuinely unresolved. Most researchers now believe the ranch itself likely had no real connection to the dish at all, and that the name was simply borrowed later as shorthand for something big, rich, and unmistakably Texan. Whatever its true origin, the dish followed the same budget logic as everything else on this list. A single rotisserie-style chicken, boiled and shredded, could stretch across a casserole large enough to feed 10 or 12 people at a potluck, especially once bulked out with layers of corn tortillas standing in for a more expensive starch and a blend of canned soups replacing an elaborate sauce made from scratch. For a Texas church supper feeding an entire congregation on donated ingredients and a shared grocery bill, that kind of stretch mattered as much as it did in any single family's kitchen. The defining technique of King Ranch chicken was layering, not cooking. Corn tortillas, torn or cut into strips, were laid down first to soak up moisture from the sauce above without turning to complete mush, then alternated with shredded chicken and a mixture of cream soup, chilies, and onion, repeated 2 or 3 times before a final blanket of shredded cheese went on top. Letting the assembled casserole rest for a short while before baking gave the tortillas time to absorb just enough sauce to soften without dissolving entirely, the same balancing act that separates a good version of this dish from a soggy one even today. Texas community cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s, the spiral-bound kind sold to raise money for a church roof or a school band trip, are full of slightly different versions of this recipe, each one credited to a different woman's name, each one insisting hers was the original. That very disagreement is itself a kind of evidence. A recipe with one famous inventor gets one official story, but a recipe that dozens of women all believed they perfected independently tells you it was already everywhere, long before anyone thought to write down where it came from. It would be easy to assume a dish this beloved in Texas simply stayed a regional secret, but King Ranch chicken spread well beyond state lines through military families stationed at Texas bases and relatives who carried the recipe home after a visit. It never really disappeared the way tuna casserole or chipped beef did. It simply became so common nationally by the 1970s and 1980s that many home cooks making it today have no idea the name has anything to do with an actual working cattle ranch at all, let alone one still operating in South Texas. King Ranch chicken borrowed its name from cattle country. The next dish on this list did not need to borrow anything. It came directly from European immigrant kitchens, a simple layering of sliced potatoes and a little leftover ham that turned one holiday roast into an entire second meal a family could stretch for days afterward. The day after a holiday dinner, a homemaker in a German or Scandinavian immigrant household would take what was left of the ham, often not much more than a bone, with scraps still clinging to it, and pair it with something the pantry never ran short of: potatoes. Thin slices went into a buttered dish in overlapping layers, a simple white sauce or a can of cream soup poured between them, and small pieces of leftover ham scattered throughout before the whole thing baked slowly into a golden crust. The technique itself was far older than the 1950s kitchen it ended up in. Layering thin potatoes with a milk-based sauce and a small amount of meat is a technique German and Scandinavian immigrant families brought with them to the United States across multiple waves of migration in the 19th and early 20th centuries, long before it became a recognizably American post-war casserole. Those immigrant communities had relied on the same frugal potato and dairy combination back in Europe, where meat was expensive and potatoes were reliably cheap and abundant. By the 1950s, the dish had been fully absorbed into mainstream American home cooking, its immigrant roots mostly forgotten, even as the technique itself never really changed. A single ham bone with a modest amount of clinging meat, the kind most families would otherwise have thrown away or used only for soup stock, could season an entire casserole of potatoes large enough to feed 6 or 7 people for a second night in a row. Potatoes themselves were among the cheapest, longest-lasting staples a household could keep on hand, sold by the sack rather than the pound, and stored for weeks in a cool cellar without spoiling. Turning holiday leftovers and cellar potatoes into a genuine second meal rather than letting either go to waste was exactly the kind of quiet household economy that kept a family fed between paydays. The difference between a good scalloped potato casserole and a mediocre one came down almost entirely to how thin the potatoes were sliced and how patiently the dish was baked. Slices cut too thick stayed hard in the center, no matter how long the dish sat in the oven, while slices cut close to the thickness of a coin cooked through evenly and let the sauce soak into every layer. Many homemakers covered the dish loosely for the first stretch of baking to trap steam, then uncovered it near the end so the top had time to brown. That small timing trick is the exact part most modern shortcuts leave out entirely. In households with Scandinavian roots, particularly across the upper Midwest, a version of this dish carried its own regional name, hot dish, a term still used today in Minnesota and the surrounding states to describe almost any baked one-pan casserole, not just this one. Grandmothers in those communities often kept the recipe entirely in their heads, adjusting the ratio of potatoes to sauce by feel rather than measurement, passing the knowledge to a daughter or granddaughter standing beside them at the counter rather than through a written card. The recipe was never written down, but every woman in that kitchen knew it by heart. It is a misconception that scalloped potatoes and ham disappeared because the dish itself fell out of favor. In truth, it survives today more than almost anything else on this list, still served at Easter and Christmas gatherings across much of the country. What actually faded was its role as a routine, several times a month weeknight supper, built specifically around leftovers. A use case that mattered far less once refrigerators grew larger and a family no longer needed to invent a second meal out of a single ham bone within 48 hours or watch it spoil. Scalloped potatoes and ham came from cold-weather European kitchens. The next dish on this list came from the opposite direction entirely, the Southwest, where cornmeal and chili took the place of potatoes and cream sauce, and a dish meant to stretch a small amount of ground beef ended up on nearly every general cookbook shelf in the country within a generation. In a Southwestern kitchen sometime in the 1920s, a home cook facing a small amount of ground beef and a pantry full of dried chilies and cornmeal built a dish that borrowed the flavors of a tamale without any of the laborious wrapping and steaming a true tamale required. A seasoned beef and chili filling went into the bottom of a dish, a simple cornmeal batter poured over the top, and the whole thing baked until the crust set firm and slightly crisp. It was tamale in spirit only, built for a cook with very little time and even less meat to spare. Tamale pie appears in American cookbooks as early as the 1910s and 1920s in California and the broader Southwest, well before the Great Depression made frugal cooking a national necessity rather than a regional habit. Once the Depression hit, the dish's built-in economy, a small amount of meat stretched by a cornmeal crust, made it an obvious fit for households everywhere, and it spread east and north through general audience cookbooks and women's magazine recipe pages through the 1930s and 1940s. By the 1950s, it had lost almost all trace of its regional Southwestern origin and was treated simply as an ordinary American family supper. Like most dishes on this list, tamale pie worked because cornmeal was extraordinarily cheap and filling compared to meat. A single pound of ground beef, seasoned heavily with chili powder, cumin, and onion, could be stretched with corn, beans, or extra sauce, and still cover an entire cornmeal crust wide enough to serve 6 people a full, satisfying plate. For a household counting every dime of a grocery budget, that ratio, a small amount of protein carried by a large amount of inexpensive grain, was the entire underlying logic behind nearly every casserole on this list, tamale pie included. Getting the cornmeal topping right required a home cook to treat it almost like a thin batter rather than a stiff dough, poured over the meat filling while both were still warm so the two layers partially fused together in the oven instead of separating into two distinct sections. Some versions used a layer of cornmeal both underneath and on top, sandwiching the filling entirely, while others, the more common post-war version, poured it only on top for a lighter, faster dish. Getting that ratio of moisture right was the difference between a crust that held together on the fork and one that turned to soup. Betty Crocker's own general audience cookbooks in the mid-20th century included tamale pie as a standard recipe, evidence of just how thoroughly the dish had crossed over from a regional Southwestern specialty into mainstream, coast-to-coast American home cooking. A homemaker in Vermont or Michigan making tamale pie from that cookbook in 1955 likely had no connection whatsoever to the Southwestern kitchens where the dish began, and very possibly did not know it had ever been regional at all. That kind of quiet, complete absorption into the national kitchen is something almost none of the other dishes on this list managed quite so thoroughly. It is a misconception that tamale pie faded because more authentic Mexican and Tex-Mex cooking became widely available in American grocery stores and restaurants later in the century, making the simplified version feel unnecessary. That played a role. The bigger factor was the same one behind most of the dishes on this list, a shift away from any recipe that required building two separate components, a filling and a crust, and baking them together for the better part of an hour, at exactly the moment American households wanted dinner solved faster than that. 9 of these dishes leaned on meat, however small the amount, to carry the meal. The 10th and final one on this list barely used any meat at all, just noodles, cheese, and a can of a product that homemakers across the entire country had been taught to trust more than fresh milk itself for exactly this purpose. A homemaker in the early 1950s, low on fresh milk with the iceman not due until the next morning, reached instead for a can of evaporated milk sitting in the cupboard, unsweetened and shelf-stable, and used it to build the cheese sauce for a simple baked macaroni instead. It was thicker and richer than she expected, coating the noodles in a way fresh milk sometimes struggled to match. By the time the dish came out of the oven with a browned, bubbling top, nobody at the table could tell the difference, or particularly cared. Brands like Carnation and Pet Milk spent heavily throughout the 1940s and 1950s marketing canned evaporated milk directly to homemakers as a practical, budget-friendly substitute for fresh milk in exactly this kind of cooking, running print advertisements that explicitly promised it would stretch a family's grocery money further. It did not need refrigeration until the can was opened. It lasted for months on a shelf, and it was often cheaper per ounce than fresh milk delivered to the door. What started as clever corporate marketing turned into a genuine kitchen habit that outlasted the advertising campaigns themselves by decades. A single can of evaporated milk, mixed half and half with water, could stand in for an equivalent amount of fresh milk at a noticeably lower cost, particularly for households further from a dairy delivery route where fresh milk cost more or spoiled before it could all be used. Combined with a modest block of cheese, often the cheapest sharp cheddar on the shelf, and a box of elbow macaroni, the entire dish could be built for pennies per serving, filling enough to serve as the main course on a night when meat simply was not in the budget at all. The trick to a good evaporated milk cheese sauce was tempering it slowly over low heat, whisking in shredded cheese a small handful at a time rather than all at once, since the higher protein content in evaporated milk could break and turn grainy if the heat climbed too fast or the cheese went in too quickly. A little dry mustard powder or a pinch of paprika stirred into the sauce sharpened the flavor enough to make up for using a lower-cost cheese. Homemakers who mastered that slow, patient whisking got a sauce silkier than most families were used to, and word of a good version spread fast at potlucks. At potlucks and church suppers throughout the 1950s, a homemaker's baked macaroni and cheese, built on that same can of evaporated milk, quietly became a point of gentle competition, whose sauce was creamiest, whose crust browned most evenly. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. The same slow, whisking technique still turns a can of shelf-stable milk into a rich, silky sauce today for anyone patient enough to try it. It is a common misconception that homemade baked macaroni and cheese was replaced because it stopped tasting good compared to newer options. In truth, it was replaced because a boxed mix could do in 8 minutes what this version took closer to an hour to accomplish: sauce making, noodle boiling, and a full bake included, at the exact moment more households needed dinner solved quickly rather than lovingly. The dish itself never got worse. The kitchens making it simply ran out of the spare hour it used to require. 10 dishes, a wartime ration book, a corporate test kitchen, an Ohio restaurant, and a can of milk that was never actually milk at all, and every single one of them was built by a homemaker who had far less money than she needed and far more skill than anyone gave her credit for at the time. What all 10 of these women actually knew, and what got quietly lost somewhere along the way, is worth sitting with for a moment before this ends. None of these women thought of themselves as inventing anything. They were simply doing the math every single week: a little meat, a lot of starch, a can of something shelf-stable, and turning it into a dinner their family would actually look forward to. A tight budget and a genuinely good meal were never actually opposites, and scarcity could still be met with real care instead of resignation. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and these 10 dishes are proof that remembering is worth the trouble. If any of these 10 brought back a memory of your own mother's kitchen or a dish your family still makes without ever writing the recipe down, you already understand exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want more of these forgotten meals brought back properly, one dish and one true story at a time. And maybe go ask your own mother about the dish that showed up more than anyone admitted out loud.